Welcome to the first technical tutorial hosted here on Sormena.org. Normally, these tutorials and all of the tutorials are going to be categorized by groups with an ongoing theme that brings it all together. So with those first 8 philosophy articles that you read, really the focus there was on mindset and trying to get you into a state of mind that's conducive to making music, especially if you're brand new to that. And I know several years ago it was very daunting for me to get started with all that was out there. And I know today it's even more daunting because the options and the choices have really quadrupled, I think, even since 10, 15 years ago. It's really quite crazy just how much is out there. Of course, this is adding to the noise that's out there, but hopefully it can be of some help to you. Now, with these first 8 technical tutorials, there's not really going to be an ongoing theme, mainly because I just want us all to get familiar with and comfortable with the idea of the technical tutorial and all the various subjects that we can cover in the future. So like always here, please give us suggestions, contact us, let us know what you're interested in so we don't spend a ton of time producing content that you could care less about. All right, without further ado, let's get into this first presentation. This first technical tutorial is all about the different ways that you can route audio in the modern digital audio workstation. So we're going to explore a variety of routing options available to you in the DAW today. We'll begin with some of the basics and work our way to the more esoteric. Esoteric may not be the perfect word here, and we could probably use an analogy to explain our process a little bit better. So if we're building a pyramid, we need to start with the foundation, and only after the foundation is laid can we move on to the next level, until we eventually reach the top. And so the top is only possible with the bottom, and the bottom is only possible with the top. And once it's finished, you really have to step back and look at it in perspective and then say, okay, what is the function of this? So if it's a house, what's the function of this building? And it's the same idea here. We're going to begin with the really basics, like just duplicating tracks. But at the very end, we're going to get into some pretty complicated topics like mid-side processing or multiband. Spectral processing is another way you might hear that described as. And by the time we get there, it's really important that you have the foundation laid. And then once everything makes sense to you, you can kind of step back and pick and choose where certain routing options are going to be best for you. Now, the majority of these routing schemes can be set up in any DAW relatively easily. And for some of the schemes, some of the routing options that aren't really made simple for you, if you're working in a particular DAW that, say, doesn't have a multi-band processor option, how do you go about setting that up? So we'll talk about that, give you some of the alternative, like brute force manual approaches in case your DAW doesn't give you that option right off the bat. So that's what we're going to be doing in this presentation. There's a lot to go over, so you definitely need to strap in and get your thinking hat on because this is going to be a lot of fun, but also a lot of information. A major talking point that I at least come back to again and again on this website has to do with your mindset for producing versus your mindset for mixing. And if you're a computer musician and most of the music you make is in the computer, you're using samples, you're using plugins, you understand how all of these work, I think it's very important that you start to tear down that wall of separation between the production stage and the mixing stage. Now, everybody looks at this differently. Some people have very strong opinions one way or the other. I recommend going to other resources to hear other people's take. But for me, this is a really important point that I think sometimes people overlook, get confused by, or end up chasing their tail in the long run. So for me, there's no reason to differentiate the tasks accomplished or the tasks that you can accomplish in either the production stage or in the mixing stage just because that may be the standard convention. You have to understand that making music in the computer isn't following the standard convention that maybe the industry, in air quotes, is teaching you. For example, if you are responsible for, if you're a recording engineer, getting a band's take. So you're recording a song from a band. Your main focus is on just getting the best recordings you possibly can. So choosing the right microphones, picking out the right preamps, and then making sure that everything goes smoothly and that you get a really good take. Well, you're not that concerned at this point with what sort of EQ are you going to use? What sort of compressor are you going to use? All of that stuff is going to be decided later on in the mix when you have the time to sit there and finalize things. When you're producing music in the computer, and let's say you're working on an 8-bar loop, if you have a kick drum sound that's driving you crazy, it only makes sense to go in and apply all of the processing that's going to remedy that situation, because you're going to be stuck listening to that kick drum over and over and over again. So once you hear that there's a quote unquote problem or there's something that you want to change, I recommend going and making that change, even if it's what would normally be considered a mixing task. So when making music in the computer, it makes sense to get the sound you are going for as soon as the idea springs into your head, because like I wrote here, you have the time, you have the knowledge, you have the tools. Don't just say, I'm just going to hold that off for the mix. No, don't do that, because you're probably going to forget about it, or you're just going to live with it. And you never want to just live with it when you're making music in the computer, because you have the time, you have the resources, you have the knowledge needed to, get the sound that you want. This is also very relevant when it comes to routing schemes in terms of breaking convention. Okay, there's I don't want to say like hard and fast rules, but there's these guidelines that people tend to now take as fact about certain ways to route audio and what the application is. Yes, there are applications that make sense, but it goes beyond just the standard convention of, okay, parallel compression. Well, you can do a lot of other types of parallel processing if you put your mind to it. It's fine to stick to the convention, but recognize the whole idea behind that routing scheme. Okay, and how it can be applied beyond just the standard conventions that many of you are aware of. Do not think certain routings only apply during production and others only apply during mixing. Like I said before, we need to break down that wall between the creating of the music and the mixing of the music. And when we do that, we get a really good result at the end of the creation stage, so that when we get to mixing, there's almost nothing for us to do, because we've mixed as we've gone, which makes sense to do in the computer. From this point on in the presentation, we're going to be defining a different routing scheme and then jumping into the digital audio workstation to look at a practical example. Remember that with these examples, always push them further. If you have your own idea, go in there and experiment with that. We're going to kick this off with duplication. Now, duplication is often overlooked, but it probably shouldn't be, because it is deemed too simple. With all the complicated things you can do in the computer, in the digital audio workstation, sometimes you forget that the easiest thing is actually the most efficient thing and can get the result that you want. Duplication is a go-to tool for adding emphasis. Typically, we're talking about like a stereo emphasis to a particular phrase or part. Remember that the focus of this tutorial is on the different routing techniques. That's really what you want to focus on. So just specifically, duplication, parallel, etc. And that in order to have this make sense to you, I obviously have to go in and do a couple of real world examples and show you a couple of techniques. These techniques are not the important part of the tutorial. I'm going to explain what I'm doing, but remember, there are a million more things you can do with each of these routings beyond what I'm showing you. That's really the point. The idea is that you understand the routings and then you come up with your own reasons for using them. All right, let's start with the oldest and easiest trick in the book, which is track duplication. So I have this hi-hat loop here. And what I want you to notice is that I do have a tool device on here, and I've brought the width down to 0. So this is basically now a mono file, where originally it was stereo. You can see that we have a left channel, we have a right channel, as compared to this vocal little sample, which is just, the one mono channel single recording. So obviously this had some sort of reverb attached to it or something, because the audio file almost looks exactly the same, but there must be some kind of difference between the left and the right. Otherwise it wouldn't be coming in as a stereo file. And that's really important for this first example, because what I want to do is I want to have a really solid hat image down the center, but I also want that kind of wide hat effect, something that you hear quite frequently. It's not as if it's being panned hard one direction or the other, in which case it would really stick out on either the left channel or the right channel, but it just sounds and feels kind of wide, and then it makes room for other parts, especially like snares or other percussion hits that might occupy the same general frequency vicinity. So we can listen to what this sounds like originally in stereo, or we can pull this down and make it mono. Cool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and I'm going to duplicate this twice. So obviously your DAW will have its own nomenclature and way of doing this. You can copy and paste. Easiest thing to do is just to duplicate the audio track. So I'm going to duplicate it twice. And I think with these two instances, I'm going to turn things down a little bit more. So what I want to do here is I want to now pan these to the left and to the right. And it's going to be the same amount. But you'll notice that when we do lock in the same amount, and let's say we're just going for roughly 70. Notice how right now you can really hear the emphasis in the left, but watch what happens as I bring this back to the right. It actually balances itself back out and goes basically into mono because the information is exactly the same, especially because we have this tool device getting rid of whatever that stereo difference was to begin with. So if we go in and check the mono compatibility of this, we're not going to hear a change at all, really. Just gets a little bit louder, it seems like. All right, so what do I do if I want to just actually make this wider? Well, in this example with a stereo file, it's actually very easy. I just need to bring back in the original stereo width. And so I could either get rid of this tool device, but just so you guys can hear the effect, I'm going to bring it up back to 100. And if you listen really closely, you'll start to hear this width coming in. And now if I go and check it, mono, then a little bit of stereo emphasis. And now what I would do is I would go and I'd kind of set a balance here, because really the point of setting this up is so I can actually kind of really de-emphasize what's happening in the mono track and emphasize what's happening out in stereo. So something like this. And then if for some reason it was being played on a club or somewhere where it's a mono system, you'll notice how well this collapses on itself. Absolutely perfect. So that's what you do if you have a stereo file and you're trying to emphasize a little bit of width without having to really use any plugins at all. The only plugin you would need is kind of like an original utility on the first instance with which you're bringing the width all the way down to 0. But apart from that, you're pretty much good to go with the stereo. So with this second example, we're going to talk about what you might have to do if you have a mono file. So I've gone back here and I've turned off the mono for now, so we will be able to listen in stereo. So if I have this vocal, let's say that I want to emphasize this last little phrase here and get that kind of like stereo wideness effect, something you very commonly hear on vocal tracks. Well, I could obviously use plugins to do that, but I can also just use a simple little duplication scheme. So let's go in here and let's do what we did before. Let's pan this kind of hard to the left and the other one hard to the right. And I'm also going to go in here and probably turn these both down just a little bit. And let's listen. So if you've been paying attention, the reason why we're not getting any added stereo width here is because this is a mono file. So if we put these exactly to the same values here, nothing's really going to change. It all is just going to come back. So we could slightly offset these and it would give us some stereo width, but that's not what I'm going to do here because I don't really want to do it that way. I'd prefer to leave these values exactly the same, but still go in and add some of that width for effect. So the way you're actually going to do this is by taking advantage of a psychoacoustic principle known as the precedence effect or the Haas effect, which basically just states that our human hearing mechanism perceives really short delays as being attached to the actual sound. It actually allows you to localize where you are in a space. So this is actually almost akin to like early reflections on a reverb, but not as complicated as that because really all we're doing is just throwing off like the phase balance here. So we're going to be emphasizing either the left or the right more based on where we position this in space relative to the original. So all this really means is I'm just going to go in here and I'm going to slightly move these around individually. So let's pull this one out and let's listen to what happens. And now let's pull this one off since it's still locked in. And there you go. We might go in and turn those down slightly, but that's pretty much the effect I'm going for. And if we actually collapse this into mono, it still gives you kind of a cool phasey effect. So you're still getting that emphasis on that last little phrase. We'll check that out.
Oh, 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 oh.
So I really like that. That's the effect I'm going for. If I want to take this even further, I can go in here and I can put these into stretch mode. Just make sure that I bring this all back. Remember, you're going to have to consult your own DAW's documentation for how you would do something like this. And now I can go and I can even like detune these a little bit to add even more emphasis. So I'm just going to do it ever so slightly. And let's take a listen to that.
Oh, 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 oh. Oh, 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 oh. Oh, 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 oh.
So there you go. Just by duplicating the audio track, there's a lot that we can do. There's even more that you can explore, especially nowadays with all of like the cool little features that you have in here. For example, I could go and I could like scale this out.
Oh, 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 oh.
Turn the loop off.
Oh, 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 oh.
Just get that last little phrase there. Why don't we even just reverse it just to go crazy?
Oh, 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 oh.
So there's a ton that you can do nowadays just by duplicating and messing around a little bit. I could even go in here and I could take it a step further by messing with the pan and just like swinging that around. So really, the sky's the limit here with what you do, and this all stems from just duplicating the track.
Oh, 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 oh.
Parallel processing. Parallel processing is directly related to what we just looked at, duplication. Only now you are applying some form of processing to the duplicate to add a layer of contrast. This just means that you have your original. You duplicate the original track, and now you have the original, it's just louder. However, if you go into that duplicate and you process it different from the original, that is what we define as parallel processing. So typically with parallel processing, you go for extreme settings because you want that really stark contrast since you're going to be making a blend. This is where the typical application of parallel compression comes into play. You squash the crap out of it. You really compress it heavily so that you get that really nice level of contrast when you mix them back in. But subtle differences here can make just as big an impact. So if you duplicate the same part 6 times and apply slightly different EQ curves to each instance, you're going to get probably a really impactful, interesting kind of sound. You can use any effect in parallel. The reason you normally don't do this is because most effects give you a wet-dry control, which really serves the same function as setting a parallel blend, only now you're using volume faders as compared to just that wet-dry control. And normally the wet-dry control is easier to use. But what I'd recommend is that you experiment with both, okay? Even if you normally take a chorus and you're used to going at that 40 to 60% range, maybe make a duplicate of the part, put that chorus up to 100%, set a blend, and then listen and hear, how do these differ? Is it easier and does it give me the same result if I just stick to on the track? What sort of result do I get when I work in parallel? Duplication and parallel processing really do go hand in hand. That is to say that in order to do some form of parallel processing, you normally need to begin by duplicating the track. So we have this drum loop here. And this is coming from the Converse sample library, great free resource out there for all of you looking for some really high quality samples. And what I like about this is actually the dynamic range. And when I say dynamic range, I just mean the difference between the loud peaks and kind of the quieter parts. So there's a good chance that some form of compression or peak limiting was applied at the time of this being recorded. That being said, we could definitely still bulk this up quite a bit by using a form of parallel compression. So in order to set that up, I'm going to begin by duplicating the track. And right now it's just going to sound louder. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on this one, and I'm going to call this my either drums crush, or we'll just call this drums parallel, so that we reinforce that idea of this routing scheme. And then I'm going to go in and I'm going to grab some kind of dynamics processor. Something called dynamics would probably work great. And so I'm going to use a technique that some of you maybe aren't as familiar with, which would be top down and bottom up compression. And so we'll begin with the, less used upward compression, or what I would call like bottom up, which just means that when the sound goes below a threshold, it actually turns up the signal. So I'm going to use this little scheme here on the left to get that accomplished. So you can see with that diagram that it's actually getting louder. And then I can do a little bit of traditional top down. But there is an issue right now, and that issue is that some of the peaks are still sticking out. And that's not what we're going for here, mainly because this is already fairly dynamic. If anything, I want to make sure that I'm pulling down on those peaks ever so slightly. So I'm actually going to bring the attack down to its fastest. And then just set the release to taste. I might go with something like that. Just bring this back some. So really just listen to the hats here and listen to how louder they are. They're almost as loud as the snare. And if I wanted, I could even go in and take this one step further by putting on like a form of peak limiting at the end. And I normally do something like this. We'll just bring this back just to make sure that we're grabbing the peaks. So there you go. That's really crushing it. That's really emphasizing and maximizing loudness. And now what I have to do is I have to go in and I need to set a blend. So instead of the normal like dry wet control, since we don't have a dry wet control on this dynamics, that's really why we're setting this up in parallel so that we can create the blend here and get a really powerful sound out of this drum loop. And even a little bit goes quite a long way. And what you'll notice is that our peak value doesn't change whether or not we bring in this parallel. So this is really an issue of maximizing what we would call RMS, or average loudness, as compared to a peak loudness. So with this muted, we can take a look at what we're maxing out at. About -9. Turn this down a little bit, and we'll bring this in. Okay, so we're bringing in a little bit, but I'll change that so that we don't get that. What I really should do is just get this peak to come up. So there you go, parallel processing. So I guess the peak level was raising a little bit, but it wasn't anything drastic, and really we were bringing up the beef from kind of the middle section there. Okay, so there you have it with parallel processing on drums. With a vocal, we can do more than just use compression, although we will start out with a form of compression here. So this is the same sound we had before, I think.
Oh, 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 oh.
And in this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to try and like hype the presence without having to absolutely like hammer an EQ or put any really extreme settings. So I'm going to call this vocal parallel presence. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by just isolating the presence, which is really something in the range of like 2, 3K and up. So this begins by putting on a form of EQ. And I'm just going to use a filter.
Oh, 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 oh.
And solo the right one, that always helps. Okay, so that should be good there. I'm then going to go and I'm going to grab a compressor. I could use the dynamics, or I could just use this compressor here, either way. And I'm going to go ahead and actually drive the input gain a little bit. And now we're going to crush this one. In this instance, I want a little bit more of that release because I don't want it to be too drastic. I want to blend nice. So now we'll bring some of that in with the original. And you can just tell how dark the original sounds after our ears have adjusted to this sound. So it sounds really dark, almost nasally. And then we bring in this parallel chain. Brightens things up, and it doesn't require us to go in and do anything too drastic with an EQ. We can keep an original version. But remember, parallel processing isn't just compression. I could just as easily here create some form of a duplicate and go extreme with settings on, let's say, like a chorus, a comb, and a flanger. And normally we would put this on the track itself and we would kind of just set a mix balance. But sometimes it's fun to experiment with what happens when you create more of a parallel chain. All right, so I'm actually just going to group these together for now so that I can easily turn this on and off. And we'll just go ahead and just blend this in. So try to find the right spot. And then we just set it in. So there you go. Still peaking on us. And then it might be fun to even go in here and take this a step further and start automating some of these controls. But this is where I'm going to leave it for now so that you can go in and experiment on your own and really dial in settings that are going to be beneficial to the music that you're making. The next routing scheme can be referred to in a couple of different ways. If you're a little more new school, you might go with the word group processing. If you're more old school, you might go with bus processing. Either way, they are exactly the same in function and in end result. So you're going to be doing the same thing whether you call it group level processing or bus level processing. You may set it up slightly differently, end result is going to be the same. So in this example, what you're going to do is you're going to take a variety of sounds, and the example I always use here are unrelated drum sounds. So let's imagine that you have an 808 drum machine and you take the kick sound from that. You then record yourself hitting, let's say, like a lampshade, and you're going to use that as a percussive element. You then grab a snare from some kind of random sample pack that's unrelated to that 808 drum machine. Your friend sends you a sample like beatboxing. And so all of these things are really what I would classify as drum, percussive, rhythmic elements, and yet they're not related in any way at all. It will be pretty obvious to tell that that 808 kick has nothing in common with the beatbox sound that your friend has sent you over, right? So this would be a time when you might use group level processing to bring them all together. And that's where you commonly use like a saturator or a compressor. Even some like analog style EQs can get that job done for you. Now, that being said, sometimes you want that stark contrast. That's part of the aesthetic. That's part of what you're going for, in which case you wouldn't apply that style of group level processing. Maybe you're really creative and you want to do something way outside of the box. So you flip a coin and you decide that you're going to group together your lead vocal, the background piano sound, and some kind of like weather sound effect that you have. So maybe it's thunder. You group those things together and you process them all with like some crazy wacky chorus, drastic EQ, a reverb, and so forth. So it will have that effect of bringing them together, but it's also going to completely change the sounds that you have, which is fine. This is all about intention here. So typically we're talking about group level processing as being a glue or a cohesive effect, but it can be used totally creatively if you want to go in that direction. The master bus. So this is, always dangerous when you say the master bus. Like I kind of cringe every time I hear that. But this is the final output stage that all your tracks are going to run through. So this is a form of group level processing or bus level processing. It's just on the most extreme level and impacting all of your sounds. So if you've heard of the mastering process, pretty much all that entails is taking your final, stereo mix, bringing it into a digital audio workstation and applying processing to the entire thing. So it can be a very much like a technical, like very subtle things. Or again, if you want to get really creative and go crazy with it, you absolutely can. But the master bus is a form of group level processing, in case you were confused about that or thought that that was something different. What we'll do is we'll begin with the most efficient and then progressively work our way back to more of the manual brute force approach if your DAW, for example, doesn't have a simple grouping or busing scheme. So the first thing is that the master is oftentimes referred to as the master bus, and the reason is because every single channel that you have tends to, by default, output to the master. So with this drum loop here, little glitch there, but if I wanted to process all of these sounds together, I could actually start by doing so on the master because everything is feeding into this master bus. So if I go in here and add something, very obvious to hear, like a reverb, you'll notice how now every sound was being affected by that reverb. But let's say that we have, more sounds going on in here. So we had a bass line or, a main lead, whatever. And we only wanted to process all of the drum sounds together and leave those other sounds separate. This is where grouping or busing comes in handy. So in this DAW, it's very easy to just select what you want to group, right click, choose group tracks, or choose Command G. If your DAW doesn't have this feature, don't worry, there's always a way to set something like this up. And the reason I'm grouping this is probably twofold. One is just for organization, so I can always collapse this down and now I have a lot of screen real estate to work with. This is especially important as things start to move more in the direction of like tablets and things. Having a lot of space on screen is important, and actually I work with quite a small laptop, so maximizing the amount of space I have is really important. And the other thing is that I can now process from this level. So if we look here, we can see that now the output is actually going to the drum group master as opposed to going just straight out to the master track. And that would be true for all of these tracks here. So I could now go into the drum group and I could again apply that reverb or apply compression, whatever it is I want to do. That's again totally up to you. So let's just use reverb for the example. And let's go in with like a preset so I can actually show you the difference here. So I'm going to look for some kind of like small room. This should work fine. And now if we listen to it, so we put all of those drum parts into this same reverb. But what's really cool about this is that I could now still process the clap individual from the rest of this group. So if I go in and add another reverb, and this time I'm looking for something that's a little bit longer and more, obvious to hear, I could go and I could find something hall, white, bright, and big. All right, that should definitely be different from the dark, small room. So now if I start to bring this in, it's only going to be applied to the clap. So there you go. Very simple to understand. And again, something that I'll leave up to you how you want to do the effect processing. So let's say that your DAW does not have a grouping function in any way, shape, or form. It still is possible to do the type of group processing we just did. So I'm just going to pull all of these guys out of the group, get rid of the drum group for now, and we'll note that now everything has reverted back to sending to the master. Okay, so as long as you can find your input and output controls, you should be good to go. And in this DAW, they just exist in this little inspector panel here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an audio track, but this audio track is actually going to serve as a bus for me. So I'm going to call this my drum bus. And now all I have to do is make sure that instead of the output going to master, I send it to the drum bus for each of these parts. So I just go in here, drum bus, clap to the drum bus, hat You guessed it, to the drum bus, and the cowbell to the drum bus. And now if we look at the drum bus, it's sending to the master. So what this means is I could still set a blend, a relative blend of all of these from here. Or again, go in and apply some form of processing to everything. The downside here is that I obviously can't go in and collapse all of the tracks in a nice organized way. That being said, the processing capabilities are exactly the same. So regardless of the DAW you have and the features it offers, it is always possible to send multiple tracks into a different audio track, which you can then process multiple parts all the same way. So there you go. That's grouping, that's busing. Experiment with that. Have a lot of fun. This goes well beyond drums. Trust me, I use grouping probably more than any other routing scheme in any given project. On now to probably the most popular and well-known routing scheme, the send and return configuration. So I would say this is the most mix-specific related routing, but it can absolutely be used in production or in the creating stage. This is related to both parallel and group routings that we've looked at already. So the way this works is you're going to send a variety of signals. So these could be from anywhere. It could be your lead vocal and your thunder sound effect into one return effect. So hopefully you can see how this is related to parallel and group. It's related to parallel because as you send that signal from the main track into your return effect, you are in essence applying some form of parallel processing. That's just what is going on there. And then it's also like a group processing because you're sending multiple signals from all over the place into the same effect. So it's kind of like a combination of the two, which in a lot of ways is a good thing, but you have to be careful about when you use it because there are times when just sticking to the group or sticking in parallel makes more sense. So here is really the kicker to this whole thing. The send amount is variable, meaning you can get a lot or a little of the effect depending on how much you send in. And we'll look at that and talk about that in more detail in the example. The send and return configuration lends itself particularly well to spatial effects, so delays and reverbs, and effects that aren't dynamically triggered, aka threshold-based dynamics processing. So sometimes you will see people set up a parallel processing chain, like a parallel compressor, I should say, in a send and return configuration. And the reason is they want to send multiple things into that crush. The problem with that is that you need to make sure that you're sending enough in to the point where it is triggering compression for each and every element. And sometimes that's easier said than done because you might have a very quiet element and you're having to like crank it all the way up. You have something that's a little bit louder and you're not sending as much. So getting those balances can be a little bit confusing. And I think we'll also look at that in the example as well. So if some of that sounds confusing now, don't worry, all will make sense in a couple of minutes. Send and return really does lend itself to more spatial effects because you have that variable control of how much is going in. So for example, I probably don't want as much reverb on the drums as maybe I'd want on the vocals, and I'm able to set that, and I can do so with the send and return. So the send and return is very much like a parallel configuration, only with the variable control of how much is going in. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to set up a send and return. In this program, they call it an effect track. But when I create this, what you'll notice is down here in the effect track, I have a couple of sliders that correspond to the tracks I have in the project. So by going in here and increasing or decreasing this, this is just sending signal in. So if we listen right now, I can make the drums quite a bit louder.
Oh, 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 oh. Oh,
just by sending them in, but it's not changing anything. It's just the sound itself. And this is why you tend to, again, go for more extreme settings like we did with parallel. It's because we're creating a blend. We still have the original dry version here and the processed version is down here. So let's just call this reverb. We'll bring up the reverb. And I think by default in this DAW, it actually does anticipate what it is that you want to do. So it will, for example, immediately jump the mix to 100%. Whereas if you put on a track, I do believe they will give you some kind of a blend there. All right, cool. So let's just go ahead and set this up and let's send some of the drums and send some of the vocals in.
oh, 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 oh. oh, 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 oh.
So we have a pretty heavily reverberated vocal and maybe a little bit less on the drums. And remember that there's always a variety of ways that you can send in to your return tracks. For example, I have the knobs here, determining how much is going in, or I could even go to the track itself and then determine how much I'm sending in. I actually like doing it directly from the return track, which is really cool. Not all programs will give you that ability, but this one certainly does. Now, there is a few things that you need to keep in mind. For example, if I take this vocal and it's very quiet, and we'll just go ahead and mute the drums for now.
Oh, 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 oh.
Listen to how this impacts the amount of reverb.
Oh, 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 oh.
So at this point, you can't hear the reverb at all, but when the vocal is all the way up,
oh, 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 oh.
that reverb is very prominent, and this involves setting up your pre and your post controls. So by default, it almost always goes directly to post, and because of this case, we have a color coding system. Auto is in yellow here, and if I go to pre, it turns to blue, okay, and post is yellow. So auto here is setting it up as post. Post just means that when I'm sending in signal, it's relative to what I have set here at the fader level. Okay, very important. So as this goes down, less is going in. However, if I go to pre, it completely disregards what I have set here on the actual channel fader and is instead actually listening to clip gain. So this is actually pretty loud in clip gain. And let's imagine that I want the vocal to be really reverby, but I want it to be quite quiet compared to the drums. Well, could I set that up by being in post? Let's find out.
Oh, oh, oh. Oh, oh, oh.
So even if I send all the way, let's say that I really want to wash it out. That's probably not enough. So I'd have to go in here and actually set this to pre, and now you'll notice that with it all the way up like this, it's going to be very loud. And now I can just dial it back. So something like that is totally possible to do. And in this case, I'd probably want to set this to pre. And this actually happens more times than you'd think, especially if you're working on something that's a little bit more experimental. You're not really following the quote unquote rules. And you might have like a chime sound and you really want it to be heavily processed with reverb, but it's very quiet in relation to your other parts. You might have to go to pre in order to get as much of that reverb or return effect as you have. So the one other thing I want to just point out here that I think is kind of important has to do with using something like a parallel compressor or, some sort of like a crush with signals like this. And the issue is really the fact that we have a threshold that we have to consider. So if I go in and I'm just going to use the compressor here because it's a little bit easier to visualize. And let's say that I want to have some kind of a crush effect. So I set up the set and return. I bring the compressor onto that. This is going to be my crush. Okay, so let's just start with the drums. We'll bring them in. So we can hear that we're getting that kind of crush effect that we had before. But let's say I start to bring in the vocal here. When do I know? And let's say the vocal is quite quiet, okay? And we're again, by default, set into post mode. It's going to be very difficult for me to even trigger any compression on this vocal because of how quiet it is relative. So if I go in here now and I'm just working with the vocal.
Oh, 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 oh.
I'm getting some, but I'm really only getting that because I have it cranked all the way to the top. If I had this vocal very quiet in the mix, I'm getting signal to come through here, but I'm not getting any kind of compression at all. And again, this is where I'd probably have to go to pre. And and then make sure I'm getting kind of what I want. But this is very tricky then, because we have the drums that are kind of doing their own thing, the vocal that's doing its own thing, and it's very easy to think that you're sending something into like a parallel compressor, but maybe all you're doing is sending volume. You're not actually getting any of that compression. So be aware of that. In this example, we have it set up properly. But it is possible to, and it's actually very common to set a scheme up like this and then completely bypass the effect entirely. So just be aware of that. This is one of the reasons why I recommend doing any kind of parallel compression in the form that we did it before. So I'd probably go in here and duplicate this and add the parallel compression, call it, parallel drums or whatever. And then if I want to do the same sort of thing for vocal, I would again duplicate it and I would add the processor directly there so that I can get the settings dialed in exactly the way that I want them. But again, personal preference, feel free to experiment, use all sorts of different effects here, and just see what you can come up with. So now that you really have a firm grasp on the what, aka all of the different routing schemes that are commonly found in the digital audio workstation, we get into the how and the why, how to apply this and why to apply it. And the first big point is that these routings are all commonly combined in every way that you could possibly imagine. For example, you could have a track affected in parallel, which is also a part of a group, and then that group is sending into a return. Very likely something like this will happen. So as much as you're going to be pick and choosing your different routing options, remember that this is all about then combining them, or this is about intention, getting what you want. So as long as you have a reason, there is no right or wrong way to use any of these routing schemes, either on their own or in some kind of combination. It's very likely that at a certain point in a project, you're going to combine all of these routings together. It just sometimes makes the most sense. So even here with just this simple drum loop, you'll see how we can have a reason to basically go to every single routing that we've talked about and looked at so far. So just as a refresher, first thing I'm going to do for organization is just group all of these guys together, call this my drums group. And what I might do is go in here and, just maybe apply a little bit of distortion to this. Just try to bring it all together. So not that much. So we've got that little bit of distortion going. I think it sounds okay, but maybe I also want to set up kind of like a parallel chain here and apply compression. So what I do here is I would duplicate this, and then with the duplicate, call it drums parallel. I'm going to get rid of the distortion in this case because I don't think it's going to be necessary. And instead what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put on an EQ first, because what I'm noticing is that there's a lot of low end here. And that can sometimes cause some issues with the triggering of a compressor. Like it's really going to cause some big problems there. So I'm just going to go in here, and just to be safe, I'm going to use just like an EQ2, and I'm going to carve some of that out. So that should be good. I don't want to get rid of all of it, but just some of it, and especially going into that compressor, because then when we go into the compressor, it will compensate for that and bring some of it up, which is fine. I'm going to go back and we'll go to the dynamics this time and do a little bit of the bottom up, top down. One a little sharper, really grab those peaks. Cool, I add a little bit of output gain here just to make up for it all. and then we can go and we can set a blend. So and now maybe this is still a little bit muddy, so what I'd probably do is I'd go and I'd group these guys together, and I'd call this something like drums final. Go in, maybe just throw on a little bit of an EQ, try to get the balance right. Cool, so I'm pretty happy with that. And now what I might do is set up kind of like a reverb for these drums. So I'd go in here and I'd create an effect track, aka a send return. I'll call this drums verb. Go on, grab a reverb. And let's see. There it is. Let's just go back to that preset we had used before. Might brighten this up a little bit, add a little bit of reverb time here, and now just send some in. And what I'm going to do, and what you'll notice that's really cool, is that I can actually go in here and I can open this up, and I could send different amounts and individually for all the tracks, but I'm just going to go from the top level here. And let's do it from the other views just so you can see it. So let's emphasize it so that you can really hear it. It's probably a little bit extreme, but as long as you can hear it, that's all that matters. And then the final thing I could do is I could actually go to the master track and I could throw on something like a peak limiter and just look to maximize loudness ever so slightly. And there you go, our drum loop is done, and we used every single form of routing in that example. We had to duplicate things to set it up in parallel. We have a send and return configuration working. We have, a lot of grouping and busing going on. We're even utilizing the master bus. So this would be very common in a project that you're working on. But you'll notice that every single time I did something, I had a reason for doing it. And that's why it's important to really theoretically understand and conceptualize what each of these routing schemes is really capable of. And then you can take it and mess with it in your own way and experiment. But you have to first understand. And hopefully that's what you've gotten out of at least these basic routing schemes. In the final section of this video, we're going to get into the more esoteric routings. So these are routings that you may commonly apply at the track level, possibly at the group level. So they really require you to understand all of your different and common routing schemes first. And we're going to talk about spectral, aka multiband processing, mid-side, and then track layers. Now, track layers is a little bit more organizational and DAW specific. That being said, I want you to stick around to the end to just recognize and realize what track layers are and how it's something that we've already talked about at length in this presentation. Again, all the routings we've talked about can be combined with these more unique methods of processing and organization. To kick things off, we're going to talk about spectral, aka multiband processing. So this entails breaking a complex signal, and when I say complex signal, I just mean a wide range of frequencies, up into distinct frequency bands that can then be processed separately. In the music making application, this is typically used as an experimental or creative effect. So let's imagine that you have a piano and you're playing really like wide-ranging chords, so from low octaves up to the highest octave on the piano. What you could do is you could actually split that up multi-band style and apply very different effects to each of those bands. So in the low end, you might have some kind of heavy distortion and in a delay. In the mid band, you might leave that alone. And in the high band, you might add some kind of shimmering reverb, maybe a chorus, maybe a different style of delay. Really the sky's the limit here. And so you've taken that regular kind of boring, drab piano and have converted it into this really complex sound. That is where I love multiband processing, and I think far too often it gets overlooked by people and only used in the secondary application, which is on the master bus. So on the master bus, you know that your full song is going to be very complex, or at least it should be in terms of frequency. So you may apply a spectral processor, or you may go to multiband processing as a means to create a balance or add emphasis. So you're listening back to your track and you're noticing, man, the low end is really weak. I'm going to go in there, I'm going to turn it up, I'm going to compress it a little, or maybe do some kind of expander, get some movement, get some pumping down there, and really tie everything back together. Maybe the high end is like really, really too bright and too loud, so I'm going to bring that down. So that would be a means of multiband processing, and that's typically how it's used today, but I also love using it creatively on individual parts that are very wide, or that have a very wide range of frequencies. So things like pads, pianos, even sometimes the human voice. You can do some really crazy and fun things, and we'll look at an example of this coming up. So we'll start by talking about the easy way to do this, and then we'll get into, again, more of the manual brute force approach. So we have this really nice, beautiful sounding pad. And, normally I'd be fine just using that as is, but if I want to get a little more creative, if I want to make this sample a little more of my own, I might go in and do some kind of a multi-band processing here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and I'm just going to grab a device I have that's called Multiband FX3. Now you probably don't have something like this in your DAW, which is why I recommend sticking around to the end so that you can see how we're going to set this up and how we can, again, kind of conceptualize it and go back to some of the earlier routings that we've talked about. So how this works is we have just a couple of these crossover frequencies, just meaning that everything that's below 208 hertz is going to fall in the low category. Everything between 208 and 3.13K is falling in mid, and everything 3.13 and up is falling into high. But of course, we can adjust these. So if I listen to this now with just the lows, I can maybe really isolate the lows, then go into the mids. That's way too much, so I'm just going to bring this back. This way we actually have something we can mess around with in the highs. And cool, so I now have a balance. Obviously, every single signal, every single sound is different, so you're going to have to probably set that manually. Commonly, in more of like a technical, sort of practical application, you'll see people using multi-band effects on the master for the whole track just to kind of set final balances. And again, you really have to be careful with those crossover frequencies to make sure that they work and make sense for whatever it is you're applying. But right here, we're more worried with just the creative application. So if I just start with the lows here, first thing I might do is grab a tool device and just really center this out. Turn it up a little bit. Go in, maybe grab a little bit of saturation or distortion. Let's use the bit crusher. So that's pretty cool. And then I might actually even go in and add a wet effect, which in this case would just be EQ. Very cool. Now we can bring in the mid-band. And again, I actually want to center this a little bit more. Get a nice range happening. And here I'll just add a rotary. And then we can go to the highs. And I might go in here and add something like, I don't know, we could go even crazy like with a ring mod. Why not? And then we could kind of automate that. So here we have the original. And now this version that we've made our own. So a lot of fun. You can spend so much time just tweaking this, but let's stop for now, turn off the multiband effects, and talk about how you can set up something like this even if you don't have a simple little container like that. And the way you would do that is actually by creating parallel chains. And in this case, we'd have our pad low, we'd have our pad mid, and we'd have our pad high. So I'll just go and delete the multiband effects on all of these just so there's no confusion. And now all we're going to do is create that same kind of like crossover frequency network that you saw before, only we're going to use EQ for that. And all we really need if we're going to set up either 2-band or 3-band is a simple little 2-band EQ. So I'm going to go and add that in. And since this is low, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set a low pass here, and let's just bring this quite a bit down. Solo this. We'll set it to be 100. And now what I'm going to do for my mid band is I'm going to actually add this onto the mid. I'm going to flip this around, put this to 100, and now find something that sounds nice. Let's just say about 400 or so. And then for my high band, I can again option click, bring this EQ with its settings over. And now all I need to do is actually take this up to 400, turn this guy off. And now all together, I actually set that to 80. So bring it up. And now you basically have that pad sound. So I could go in here to the lows, add my tool device again. Really emphasize that, bring in some distortion, do whatever effect processing I want to do. Probably would make sense to group all of these guys together and just call this something like pad multi. Okay, so that's the idea with multi-band effects processing. You're not going to use it all the time, but this is definitely an area in computer music creation that hasn't been fully exploited or really fully explored. So you can use this effect and really make it your own. Up next, we have the mid-side configuration. So with mid-side, you're taking a stereo signal. Very important to emphasize. It must be a stereo signal. And then what you're going to do is be splitting out the mid information independent of the side information. So what constitutes mid? What constitutes side? So this is, again, really important. It's a stereo file to begin with. So the mid is what's the same between the left and the right channels. Okay, so what is being picked up exactly equally in the left and in the right. And then the side is what's the difference. So that's really how you define stereo anyway, is that there's some kind of different information in the left channel as compared to the right channel. And that is going to constitute side in the mid-side configuration. So what this really means is that you can process the mids differently from the sides, or you could maybe emphasize and enhance one versus the other. Maybe you'd prefer to have the stereo information brought up and the mids brought down a little bit. The sky's the limit here, really. Now, this is possible to set up in any DAW. Some give you a nice little like mid-side split device bundled with it, but others don't. However, if you have a utility device, you will be able to very easily isolate the mid and the side information on a stereo signal, and we'll look at that and talk about it in the example. This is more of an experimental effect in production and more of a utility or practical effect in mastering. Again, maybe there's a slight imbalance. Maybe you want to EQ the mid differently from the side. So for example, on the mid, maybe you really want to solidify that bass. And so you add some kind of a boost, but on the sides you have a cut. And then on the sides, maybe you emphasize the reverb or like, the air of the reverb. So the really high frequencies, because like a room in general with reverb, it's enveloping the room. So it should really be in stereo and you want to emphasize that. Again, though, this can be used both in a very creative way in production or in a utility, practical sort of way, and maybe more of a mastering sort of application. All right, so with mid-side, typically the way this works is you'd have a plugin that has some kind of like mid-side encoder, decoder built in, for example, on an EQ. But if you want to just manually isolate the mid and the side information, there are a variety of ways that you can go about doing that. The first is, if you're really lucky, you'll have something like a mid-side effect already built in. So I can go in here, I can find the mid-side split, and now I can isolate what is the mid and what is the side. So that's the mid information for the most part. And that's the side information for the most part. And if I wanted to do processing on the mid, I could put all my plugins in this little box. If I want to just process the side, I could put all my plugins in this little box. But most of us aren't that lucky. We don't have some kind of a mid-side split effect built into our digital audio workstation. So there are a variety of ways to try to accomplish the same thing. The first is, if you have a utility, you could actually go in, bring the width down to 0, bounce this out, and I'd go and I would call this pad mid. And then I could go and I could expand this all the way out to hopefully be getting just the side information. And I could bounce this out and call it then pad side. And then when we group these together, solo it, we have our pad. Like so. So that would be one way to do it. And then what you would do here with the mid is you could solo the mid. And then you could go in and, for example, like EQ these differently. So this is the classic like mid-side EQ. So let's just grab the EQ5 in this example. Maybe do something like this. And then on the sides, we do something like the opposite. And then again on the sides, maybe you want to do something like, I don't know. There's just so many options here. This is why I like to try to leave it up to you. But we'll put a frequency shifter on here. Something like that. And if we want a little bit of movement on the mids, we could go and add the rotary. And you might be thinking, isn't it a little bit silly to be like trying to then like do a little bit of an auto pan on the mids? And I would say in this example, not really. The low end's not that low endy where it's going to get in your way. But again, everybody has their own opinion and way of approaching this. One other option you have if you don't even have like a utility is to use a free plugin. So that free plugin, which sometimes works well, sometimes it doesn't, is the HOFA for You meter. Now, it always works well, but it doesn't always work well in this application. The plugin itself is quite good. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here and I'm going to change my mode to mid-side. Okay, and when I go to mid-side, now this is our mid information, this is our side information. So if I just isolate the mid, I can bounce that. Or I can go in here and I can just isolate the sides by turning the mids all the way down. So we'll bounce that out. So this is the pad mid. And this is the pad side. And you'll see that you get a slightly different result to what we just got before. And we can group these together. Get rid of that original pad now. And then again, I could go in and I could apply, various processing to both of these sides. And again, the common thing you see with mid-side is a lot of times in a mastering application for balance purposes, but you can use it creatively, just like we talked about with multiband. You really have to be creative though here, because there are no hard and fast defined rules. There really aren't even any conventions. So just experiment, have some fun, see what you can do with this. And finally, we have layers. So layers is a term that's kind of specific to particular DAWs, or this application is specific to particular DAWs. It's a way of creating parallel chains all nested in a single track. So this is all about organization. Normally, what you would do if you were creating something in parallel, so if we had a vocal part and we wanted to have like 3 or 4 parallel chains, we would duplicate it onto 4 different tracks and then at the end just group them all together. But in the case of layers, you can do that all from within one singular track. Now, I know this is possible at the time of recording this video in Ableton Live and Bitwig Studio. It's possible that more DAWs offer this, but this is an organizational tool, not a new way to process your sound. It may be more convenient, it might make you to think a little more creatively and go outside the box, but fundamentally, this can still be accomplished using traditional groups or even manual routings if you want to go that route. With layers, or what are also referred to as chains, what we really have is an organizational system as compared to a very specific routing means, which then leads to new types of processing. So as I go through and I apply the quote-unquote FX layers, you're going to notice that it's not that much different from a different scheme we've looked at. So I just grab the FX layer here like so, and by default, I get no sound, and that's because we need to add in the layers. So to do that, and to just get your default, I'll start with adding 3 different layers here, and now it's just going to sound kind of loud. But I could go in here, I could pan one slightly left, pan one hard to the right. Go in, add some kind of a chorus here. And then the other one, maybe I'd add in a flanger and a delay. Again, the sky's the limit, there's no rules. Use the delay 1. Then my feedback effect, I might actually pan this back the other direction. Cool. So something along those lines. But if you notice, what's happening here is this is no different than us just setting up parallel chains. So I could just go in here, set up parallel chains on this one, pan it slightly to the left and add in the chorus like I have set up here. And then with this one, I could go in and I could, add a tool, pan it slightly to the right and add the effects processing here. There's really no difference at all. The only added benefit here is how easy it is to process and the organization that we have. So we can set balances right from here. After we've applied the FX layer, if we put an effect outside, it's now applying it to everything. So if I want to reverb to everything, I don't have to worry about grouping it all and then at the top level putting on that reverb. I could just go in here, grab the reverb, apply it to after all of these effects layers have gone through. So the signal flow is coming in, splitting this out into 3, and then at the end, it's basically summing it all together, and then it's coming into this reverb. So there you have it, working with layers or chains. Not a very difficult thing to understand once you've understood or have come to terms with all of the other routing schemes that we've spent so much time going over. So I hope by now you've really got a firm grasp on some of these ideas and can now implement them into your own music. To wrap things up, routing schemes serve two main purposes. Number one, new ways to process sound. We've certainly heard and seen a lot of examples of that. Number two, more efficient ways to process sound. Sometimes having something like a group or like a layer, it's efficient. It makes processing a little bit more fun and a little less tedious. So it would be wrong to say that part of the routing schemes isn't to do with efficiency, because it absolutely is. It's so quick and so easy now to make groups, whereas in the past you really had to set up a lot of things manually. So this means that you can spend more time with the effect processing and less time having to do, the tedious actual setting it up, manual labor sort of things. The line is blurring between the producer and mix engineer. Don't think some of these routing schemes, or even routing schemes in general, aren't important just because you're not into mixing. This has nothing to do with the distinction between creating music and mixing music. All of these routing schemes have just as many applications in both of those stages. Once you understand the logic, you should have no problem putting these different routing schemes into your productions and creations. So I encourage you to take some of these ideas, push them further, and if you discover something new, feel free to talk about it in the comment section. Thank you very much.